Prussia, classically known as the army with a state, is probably one of the most powerful nations in the game. Germany has an immense amount of coal and iron, making Prussia's early game extremely strong. At the same time, they lack important resources like opium, silk, and dyes, making colonization important for Prussia's mid-game. The late game for Prussia is, of course, completely intolerable due to performance issues, so handle that how you wish. Either way, in terms of the game plan here, I'm going to play an extremely diplomatic Prussia this game. That doesn't mean no war at all, but I want to show off some of the horrifically buried tooltips that I discovered, which, according to my stream chat, no one has ever seen before. I'm also going to go for a Vanguardist playthrough today. Vanguardists in Victoria 3 are one of the 3 socialist archetypes and are the most authoritarian of them. Essentially, the plan is to play German Stalin here, and I'm going to show you how to become a council republic relatively quickly. I'm also going to go over what a command economy in Victoria 3 is. For now, let's unify Germany. First off, let me talk a bit about diplomatic incidents. As Prussia, I highly recommend opening up with a puppet Denmark play. In about half of cases, Denmark will just back down, and in other cases, great powers will join and they probably won't back down. Sometimes, diplomacy in this game can feel horrifically unpredictable. This is the part where you'd expect me to say, but it's actually not. However, in reality, it truly is horrifically unpredictable. I wish it weren't, but alas. Nonetheless, here's something you might not be aware of. I'm just gonna play this footage, and if you know the game, you'll see how significant this is. So as you can see, there is, in a way, predictability in diplomacy, but you can only get access to it once you start the diplomatic incident. What this is useful for is the addition of war goals. You can predict the effects of additional war goals on enemies joining based on how close they are to siding with your enemy. Basically, the way AIs determine who to support is whichever side has the most reasons for them to join in. Most nations have a pretty heavy bias towards neutrality, but if they hate you and like your opponent, they may join against you. Keep in mind that as war goals are added, this sympathy number, as odious as it is, will increase and your infamy will increase. This means you can pretty quickly spiral into bringing every power against you. The next important thing is that you can see how the AI's strategies impact their willingness to join. For example, we can see that Russia is leaning towards neutrality thanks to their acquire colonies strategy. I haven't extensively tested this, but I would encourage everyone watching this to keep an eye out for the modifiers that strategies provide in different situations, since if you can learn what each strategy does, you can predict outcomes much more easily even if you can't see the actual numbers before the incident. Let this be a lesson to you. Check your potential opponent's strategies and try to predict their behavior based on it. I'm certainly going to do it from here on out. Okay, anyway, so opening moves for Prussia. Puppet Denmark and hope they back down. If they don't, reset until they do. It's definitely going to take a couple restarts, but I get it semi-consistently. Next, bankroll Hanover, Oldenburg, Hamburg, Bremen, and Brunswick. We're doing this because we need to add them to our customs union so they'll be loyal to us. We're hoping to get obligations, but we're in no rush, so it's alright if we get unlucky on the obligation. Beyond that, use the rest of your diplomatic power to improve relations with the smallest German miners. We want to integrate all the tiny guys first, if possible. As well, research nationalism immediately, since once that's researched, we can start confederating with the other German miners. In terms of buildings, I recommend building a couple construction sectors and then getting lots of tools and iron going. Similar to the video I did on America, we're going to first build up the construction sector by getting our construction goods price to go down. We also will be needing steel, which we'll use for motors industries and then railroads later on. While you're building up your construction goods, you can slowly add in more construction sectors as you get cheaper and cheaper goods, while also gaining more taxable population through the German miners you're absorbing. You'll also want to build shipyards, ports, and naval bases in East and West Prussia, because we're going to eventually want to colonize and go overseas, as well as keeping our convoys safe in case we end up in conflict with other great powers. Keep in mind that although I'm queuing this stuff up in 1838, it's not going to get built for a couple years. This is fine since I'm just planning ahead, but it will also get faster since as we go, we'll be adding construction zones. I tend to play the game with a huge construction queue at all times, and then I alt-click to add things right away. For example, I'm building universities across the country right now, but I noticed paper was getting expensive, so I fast-tracked some paper mills using alt-click. This way I don't lose sight of my long-term plans, but I can still put things at the front of the queue when I need to. When it comes to Hanover and other German states that aren't already in your custom union, You should be able to get them into your customs union with an obligation from bankrolling them. You might have to wait until their relations reach 80, which can take a while, but eventually they'll fall in line. Beyond that, the game is just about waiting until you can federate with all the German miners and become the North German Federation. Unfortunately, once you do become the North German Federation, you can't confederate with anyone until you get pan-nationalism. In my case, I became the North German Federation before I confederated with Hanover, making this kind of ugly-looking nation exist as a cancer in my country. It is what it is. Anyway, now we can look outwards, in this case towards the Netherlands. We're not going to conquer them though, just because a war against the Netherlands might get us in trouble with the other great powers. What we are going to do though is peacefully protectorate them. We can do this by bankrolling them and improving relations with them until they join our customs union. This is the easy part. The hard part is actually getting the protectorate status. There are a couple things to look out for. First off, any nation that has the defend borders strategy will get a -25 modifier to accepting a protectorate demand. Going back a little bit, I was eyeing up Belgium as a potential protectorate, but we can see that they have defend the borders. The -25 malice that comes with that means even with the maximum army projection modifier, the highest possible relations, and an obligation, you cannot convince them to become a protectorate. At the time I was recording this, I wasn't aware of how massive that malice was, so I tried with Belgium anyway. This would ultimately be a waste of my time, unfortunately. The strategy behind protectorates is that they are essentially puppets in all but name. Although they maintain their autonomy, a protectorate can become a puppet extremely easily. When a protectorate joins you, they can't leave unless you grant them independence, unlike with regular customs unions who can opt out as they see fit. A protectorate can also be turned into a puppet for minimal infamy once relations are below 20. You can also protectorate the various German miners, although you don't have to. The reason to do this is to just ensure that they don't abandon your union out of nowhere. I often find Britain or Russia sniping German miners like Oldenburg or Hamburg off of me, which is really annoying. In this particular game, Hamburg briefly entered the British market, although I got them back later. While doing this, it's important as well to build up your army. The larger your army, the easier it is to make protectorates, who will generally be more willing to go under a strong nation. You can also increase your military wages to increase your army power projection, which will make nations more willing to become protectorates too. As you manage protectorates, you might notice that you can click the Form Germany button. I actually don't recommend doing this right away because we don't want to miss little guys like Württemberg or Baden who tend to support Austria. Instead, we want to launch a leadership play against Austria so we can cripple them. When doing the leadership play, I added a bunch of war goals. I was considering taking Bohemia and Moravia, but my fear was gaining a bunch of infamy and making all the German miners leave my customs union, as well as pulling in great powers against me. I chose to just grab Tyrol since it's got gold. France was willing to join the war in exchange for a regime change in Krakow, so I figured why not? Having France makes my place in this war pretty strong. I also invited Russia for an obligation, but they didn't respond to the offer fast enough and didn't end up joining the war. This war actually went far worse than I would have liked, and it's mostly because they didn't get shrapnel artillery. Although skirmish infantry are really good against line infantry, Austria has a massive army, and breaking through it is extremely difficult because the amount of land a front takes when it wins a battle is based on how many units are defending it. I had two fronts in Austria, one in Bavaria and one in Silesia. The Bavaria one had way fewer defenders, which made pushing a little easier, but the one in Silesia was an absolute slog. Defeating Austria is surprisingly hard as North German Federation, and the way to make it easier is to get shrapnel artillery early on in the game. Either way, I eventually got a piece of Vienna under control and then chose to just defend that front until I won. The war cost me a lot of people, and it really shouldn't have, but it's alright. You can learn from my mistakes here. With the war over, now every German miner supports me except Luxembourg. I was okay with this, and just let Luxembourg go. I chose to form Germany in 1855, and it had the additional territory of Tyrol. Not bad. It was also at this point that I managed to get the Netherlands as a protectorate, and I got Belgium into my customs union, but that sneaky defend the borders modifier made it impossible to go all the way, unfortunately. My market was still pretty strong, with the Netherlands and their colonies providing dyes and sugar to my market. Belgium didn't have much for the time being, but they'll most likely leave my market the first chance they get since I used an obligation to get them in. It's fine though, we don't need Belgium. With the Netherlands as a protectorate, I started damaging relations so that once we get to below 20, I can puppet them for just a tenth of the infamy cost. I'll show that off later once it actually happens. My next target for protection was Sweden. Sweden doesn't really have a whole lot of purpose for my market, given that they have nothing that Germany doesn't have, but it's nice to just get more population in the market. Although right now our standard of living sucks, eventually we'll be draining these nations dry of their people as they migrate over to live better lives in Germany. Germany is an absolute powerhouse in Victoria 3. This is because they have a relatively high population available for all the natural resources in their nation. We're going to build up our nation's natural resources and then get started on raising the standard of living so that we can get even more population from our protectorates. The way to get standard of living up is to generate highly paying jobs and to cheapen consumer goods like clothes, food, and furniture. We have a distinct lack of opium in our nation, unfortunately, but luckily there's a big source of it over in Baluchistan. So while you're building up your consumer goods and raw resources, let's go imperialize Makran and Kalat, who are extremely easy. Thankfully, we built up those naval bases and ports earlier, so invading them will be easy. In my case, they just backed down, but had they not, it's important to have those boats ready. I then made Sweden a protectorate relatively easily and began damaging relations with them, just like with the Netherlands. Alongside this, I was researching malaria prevention so I could go and grab up Mittel Africa. See, here in Germany, we desperately need sugar and dyes. These two resources, alongside rubber, are holding back our economy heavily, and Central Africa has tons of all three of those things. I chose to rush for malaria prevention even though I was behind the times, simply because by getting it as early as 1861, I can colonize basically the entirety of the continent without any contest from other GPs. In Victoria 3, it's often underestimated how powerful Africa is simply thanks to the agricultural land available there. Dyes let you make way more clothes and glass, and sugar lets you make a ton more groceries. We're going to colonize Africa from both ends of the continent and meet in the middle. This will also block off all the European powers from getting anything in Central Africa. Later on, we're going to look at various great power economies and you'll understand why what I'm doing is absolutely obliterating them. Okay, I want to back up real quick though. This is colonialism and all that, but behind the scenes I've also been reforming society a bit. First off, voting rights. I'm not looking for census or universal voting yet, but wealth voting is a nice stepping stone, so I got that as a way to give some power to the people. I also changed over to cultural exclusion so that new immigrants to the nation from our various protectorates won't be discriminated against. Remember that our goal is to raise standard of living. This is more difficult if pops are receiving a lower wage due to discrimination. The goal, as stated in the introduction, is to become a Vanguardist State, which definitely can take a while, but instituting voting rights helps give clout to interest groups like the trade unions who will help bring about the politics we want. Luckily for me though, the Spring of Nations popped up in 1861. Normally, this event is horrifically bad and will actually ruin the entirety of Europe, but in my case, it's perfect. I chose to support the radicals, and we're going to bring about the revolution. What this event does really is change every interest group's leader to radical. Radicals want voting and they want republics. Normally that sucks, but we actually want to become a republic and implement even more voting, so we're going to make it through the springtime of peoples mostly unscathed. Sometimes you get this the good word of the revolution event, which looks confusing at first given that you get to choose between making all your interest groups happy or making them upset. The obvious choice is to make everyone happy, but what happens when you do this is that a neighboring nation will now have the springtime of the peoples. In theory, if you want to not spread liberalism around, don't click this. But since the AI can't handle revolutions very well, it's actually insanely powerful to just spread liberalism everywhere. We're going to always allow the revolutionary ideals to spread in this case. As more events pop up, do everything you can to encourage radicalism so that we can pass to a republic. In the meantime, the colonies in Africa are growing, and we're ready to puppet the Netherlands. Notice that it only costs 2.9 infamy. This is basically a free puppet. The even nicer thing is that when turning a protectorate into a puppet, they're extremely likely to give in even with the support of other nations. I'm not sure why, but in my experience, protectorates almost always give in to puppet plays, and I can't find any math behind it. It feels like there's a bias towards protectorates accepting, although that's just my anecdotal evidence, so take it with a grain of salt. Either way, the Netherlands backs down, and now we have control over them, and the East Indies. Beyond the Netherlands, I got pretty militarily ambitious and chose to go after Austria next. I was going to grab South Tyrol just because it's a relatively small infamy state, and I wanted to go to war for something else. See, the best way to rip apart Austria is not to take states from them, it's to force them to release nations. This fills a double purpose. We can make Austria weak, and we can also protectorate the various nations that Austria spits out. All nations cost 30 diplomatic maneuvers to liberate, so we can force Austria to spit out Hungary, Bohemia, and Galicia. This war went much better because now I've got shrapnel artillery and field hospitals for my army. You can really feel the power difference from those artillery in this war. We very easily occupy Vienna, winning this war with relative ease. As well, I ended up saving my puppets and protectorates from 1,000 revolutions because I've been spreading the springtime of nations to them. Unfortunately, if a puppet or protectorate loses the revolution war, they stop being a subject to their overlord. So even though I want to spread republicanism, I actually can't let my subjects lose these wars. This means I'm going to eventually become a republic ruling over a bunch of monarchies, which I think is kind of funny. Anyway, with those new nations released, it's time to protectorate them. Funnily enough though, Hungary is actually so powerful that they're a great power. Let that show you exactly how much power Hungary contributes to Austria and why divorcing the two is so powerful. I'm still going to make friends with Hungary so that in case they ever drop a rank, we can subjugate them. Throughout this time, I've also been liberalizing the country, passing voting rights and freedom of speech laws to further the springtime of the peoples. I also was able to puppet Sweden using the same protectorate into puppet technique, although they didn't back down. In this case, no external powers joined in, yet they stood up against me anyway. I find that interesting. I simply naval invaded Stockholm and won the war with no hiccups. Anyway, as the war waged on, I was moving towards a republic, and there's a really cool interaction with becoming a republic while the Springtime of Nations is on. If you fail to pass the law to become a republic, you get an event where you can force it through by just executing the king at the cost of massive approval with the conservative establishment. I chose to do this because it felt in line with what I was doing this playthrough, but at the same time it is extremely painful to get that hit to approval like that. Germany now has its beautiful tricolor flag, and we're on our way to becoming a Vanguardist state. For now, we're an extremely liberal, free nation, but those rights that our people enjoy will eventually be stripped away. Interesting interaction, by the way, when you puppet a monarchy that has a personal union as a republic, you don't keep the personal union nation under your control, so I lost control of both Luxembourg and Norway once I became a republic. Anyway, the Springtime of the People's journal entry completes if you have universal suffrage and a republic, and no insurrectionary interest groups. Unfortunately, because of that small act of regicide I did before, the conservative establishment decided to be permanently insurrectionary, meaning I never got to complete the journal entry. To this day, I do not know what happens if you get a revolutionary victory. One day I may find out. As quickly as the liberal revolution came, it also went, as the intelligentsia, who were a powerful interest group in government under Stefan Hofer von Lobenstein, put through some labor rights. This event comes up as a journal entry when socialism is researched, and is fulfilled when any powerful socialist interest group gets into government. I actually didn't even notice that I got the journal entry until I suddenly got the triumph from the socialism event. This event ensures that certain interest groups will always pick any of the socialist ideologies. Thanks to the immense clout that the intelligentsia and the trade unions had, I was able to pass the Counter-Republic law almost instantly. And at the same time, Hungary went through a revolution, which got their prestige low enough for them to drop to major power. You're going to see me start implementing a parliamentary republic again, and that's not because I'm trying to go back, but instead because I'm placating a revolution that was brewing. I was cancelling and redoing the law change over and over again as a way to keep them from rebelling against me. Although I'm pretty strong, a civil war would ruin my nation given that the revolutionaries tend to pop up in the west end of the country, the part of the country with all the iron, coal, munitions, and arms industries. I probably won't be able to beat that. If all this isn't enough, the suffragette movement popped up just a year after we became a council republic, which I'm always happy to see since it just gives us a larger workforce ratio. Over time, the revolutionary elements of the country slowly died down as our standard of living was shooting through the roof thanks to the powerful economy I'd been constructing and the new worker cooperative ownership methods we had. I'm going to go over worker cooperatives in a second. I first want to get through the suffragette stuff since it's all happening so fast. I was able to get women's suffrage with ease because the intelligentsia were already such a huge political force, and I even got an event that changed another interest group to being feminist, which means the suffragette movement basically went through without a hitch. Along the way to the true triumph from socialism, I implemented a more progressive tax system since without the investment pool of capitalists, my budget was kind of falling apart. I managed to get the Workers' Republic event for being socialist for a few years. This is where you get to specialize your Council Republic into either communism, Vanguardism, or anarchism. Essentially, Vanguardists are like Stalinists, so I want to try that out since I hadn't tried it before. I got a new journal entry called State and Revolution, which is a book by Lenin, funnily enough. Anyway, getting to command economy is going to take a while since central planning tech is a pretty late game technology, but before we talk about command economy, let's talk about worker cooperatives. When you become a council republic, you switch over to using worker cooperative ownership methods in basically every building. Worker cooperatives are quite strong, since they take the ownership shares normally held by capitalists and aristocrats, and share them amongst every worker in the business. What this means is that the wealth generated by profits from the industry are spread more thinly, but across a larger group. This actually has an immensely funny effect of hugely widening wealth inequality in the nation depending on how profitable your industries are. For industries that generate high profits, those workers will reach insane wealth levels, while less profitable, or God forbid, unprofitable industries will see those workers literally starving. Where previously the capitalists were consistently on top of the pyramid and the workers on the bottom, now there's sort of a reconstruction of the pyramid with certain workers having immensely high amounts of cash depending on their industries, and others having almost no cash. We've basically reorganized wealth levels to an industry sector as opposed to class membership. Think of worker cooperatives sort of like an exacerbating effect on the good and bad results of successful and failing industries. Where in a privately owned or publicly traded industry, capitalists take on the negatives of lower profits, with worker co-ops, everyone takes that pain on. Generally speaking though, worker cooperatives will generate a huge standard of living thanks to those profits being distributed to all the workers. If a business isn't making any profit, then there are no dividends to distribute at all, which makes everyone employed with that business horrifically poor. The big effect of this, above all, is that when everyone has higher standard of living, they start buying more stuff, which creates immense demand for consumer goods. I sort of explained the consumer economy in the previous video on America, but in case you didn't see that one, here's the diagram again. If you want more details, check out the America video. We're going to shift towards a style of economy mostly because it's honestly the best way to play the game if you're not going for a war economy. As Germany, we have a pretty big military sector, but quite frankly, it's only a tiny portion of the economy compared to the need for chairs and lazy boys that our people can afford now thanks to the worker cooperatives. The other thing that comes out of a socialist economy is a lack of investment pool. This is because you no longer have any capitalists or aristocrats who can pay into it. Even if you stay on interventionism or even laissez-faire or something, you can't really generate an investment pool. This is why getting to graduated taxation is really important, since you start to tax the dividends that your people are taking in. We're going to be relying on those dividend taxes now, since we can't keep the economy afloat on the back of capitalist investment. This is a pretty huge disadvantage going with Council Republic, but it often is worth it since the taxes from dividends you'll be making will be huge, since not every worker is making dividends. Without the better tax laws, a Council Republic is almost guaranteed to fail. That's more or less objectively what a worker co-op does for you. It certainly has its uses, and it honestly is really powerful, especially if you're willing to really micromanage your buildings and ensure they're always making huge profits. If you can create sufficient demand for all your industries, you can definitely have huge standard of living increases at the cost of losing the investment pool. So now we have to talk about the additional piece of communism, and in particular Vanguardism in the game: command economy. Once you've got central planning, you can implement it, and here's what it does for you. You get some authority and tax capacity, as well as a new ownership method called government run. This comes at the cost of having obligatory subsidies on every building in the game. It also changes subsistence farms to a different method, but to be honest with you, the subsistence farm change is so minor that it's not worth covering. So obviously, the forced subsidies can absolutely ruin an economy if it's not ready for it. You're going to notice the moment that you switch over to command economy that your expenses will rise to pay subsidies for industries that you might have forgotten you even had. Your first task upon becoming a command economy is to hunt down industries that don't make money, either accept that they'll be draining your balance, or to close them down. Here's the thing that makes it objectively a negative. If you have interventionism, you can just subsidize anything you want anyway. Command economy forces your hand, where with interventionism you can subsidize anything you want whenever you want. In return, you get tax capacity, which is kind of useless to be honest, and you get some authority, which is kind of useful actually, depending on your nation. The other thing you get is the government-run ownership method. This method replaces owners with bureaucrats who take dividends instead of workers or capitalists. Here's the thing. A bureaucrat owner is essentially just a capitalist, but they don't generate an investment pool, and their ideology is usually intelligentsia. I'm going to be honest with you. This is an objectively worse ownership method than literally anything else in the game. In all cases, I would rather have anything else, since that's all the government run does. There were rumors that government run ownership made the profits go into your budget, but this is not the case. The profits of a business that is government run are paid out as normal to the owners of the building, which in this case are the bureaucrats. I had some choice words when I figured this out over on my stream. I just really want to understand this. Why do bureaucrats exist? Why do these guys exist when they just take the money from the government-run business? Is this not literally... Is this game trying to send a political message about government-run business? Is this like a Republican talking point about how the bureaucrats just take all the money when you have a state-run enterprise? Are they simulating embezzlement when they give all of the money to the bureaucrats and none of it to the government when it's a government-run enterprise? Is that what they're trying? Is this a political commentary? I don't. This is my money, but I don't get any of it. I get to tax some of it, but if I do a worker co-op, I tax the same. It's actually even. I should get even more tax. See, when I work co-op, it makes more money for me and for the workers. Is there ever a place where command economy is good? No, there isn't. I get more tax and the workers get the money instead of the bureaucrats who are just siphoning money from the government. They're just capitalists that you can't do an investment pool with. Doesn't make any damn sense, man. So in terms of command economy, it's absolute garbage in pretty much all cases. The forced subsidies are objectively worse than just being interventionists and deciding what subsidize it will. In return, the only solace you can take is the authority. But 25% authority is not enough to justify the immense subsidies you'll be permanently paying. The thing to remember about subsidies is that even profitable industries will take subsidies because of a concept called normal wages. This little-known game mechanic is a measurement of the average base wage paid across all your incorporated states. Base wages are determined by the average wealth of the state that a business is located in. Think of normal wages as something like the average minimum wage across your core territory. When you subsidize any industry, If the base wage of its workers is below the normal wage, then that business, even if it is profitable, will subsidize the wages of those workers to bring them up to the normal wage. This means that with command economy, you end up creating a significantly higher minimum wage across the entire country. That being said, once again, you can always use interventionism to do this with selected businesses anyway, since this normal wage feature is not exclusive to command economy. This does provide the benefit of a basically permanently increasing standard of living thanks to the heightened wages across the board for all pops, but it pretty much requires you to raise taxes to the max to make up for the immense subsidies you'll be paying. In my opinion, this is not worth it, ever, basically. To be clear, I still grew the economy extremely well and was able to accrue like 4,000 construction points, despite all the subsidies, because ultimately, if you're good at the game, you can still make even a bad economic system work, but I did have to switch to very high taxation to keep my budget afloat. No matter what I did to try and fix my budget, I was still having trouble keeping afloat without raising taxes. Regardless of the lackluster command economy, I managed to catapult Germany's GDP to $1 billion relatively quickly, and the ever-rising standard of living in the nation resulted in a massive population boom from all the immigrants I was getting. I was able to protectorate Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and Galicia, which I haven't shown via the footage here just because it was relatively uneventful. Basically, I've been stealing pops from across my various puppet states, and I've truly turned Germany into a socialist paradise through the Vanguardist movement. I did fulfill the State and Revolution journal entry, but it just gave me some throwaway modifier that I didn't really care about, so I didn't bother covering it. I also switched over to oligarchy to represent the Vanguardist ideals of an authoritarian state-run economy. I've played in my off time as anarchists before, and to be completely honest, anarchists have a way cooler journal entry set than the Vanguardists. This was kind of lame in that sense, although I had a ton of fun doing the Protectorate puppet and pop theft strategy. I would highly recommend it as a way to safely gain power without invoking the ire of great powers. I didn't even fight all that many wars in this game besides dealing with Austria and the occasional subject rebellion. I haven't seen the communist path of socialism yet, so I may try that next. As for this video, I'm pretty proud of this Germany I've constructed and all its subject states. The way immigration works in this game, it can be honestly just as powerful to get people into your market and then sap their population than it would be to conquer them, since all it takes is a bit of bankrolling and time. I'd highly recommend this playstyle for just about any nation. By the way, if you're wondering about Africa, I do in fact have basically all of Africa, and the big effect this is having in the game is the fact that all the great powers have like no GDP. Basically, I've been starving everyone of all the best goods by having my trade routes on protect domestic supply as a protectionist market, which makes getting large amounts of goods really difficult. By controlling so much of what would normally be easy access on the market, I've starved the world of goods. You can see this reflected in both the GDP and the standard of living of most of the world. Only Russia is keeping relatively close to their normal route in the game, since I often made trade agreements with them so I could test my protectionist theory. Although it isn't easy to spot, the effect of controlling a majority of the world's raw materials is huge. Russia has only grown at all because I have allowed them to. Consider in your games what effect you can have on the market by stopping the flow of goods. You can also consider the effect of flooding the market. I haven't tried a super export economy yet, but I could imagine causing some local industries to collapse by spamming out goods as a free trade country or something. So that was Prussia, and then Germany. Certainly an extremely powerful nation, although I tempered that power with the discipline of diplomacy. Ultimately, we went down the path of communism and economic monopolization, which wreaked havoc on the other nations of the world. In terms of my conclusions on counter-republics, they're fine in my opinion, but are honestly about as good, if not only marginally better, than a well-run interventionist economy. I think command economy is garbage though, and without some buffs to it, I couldn't see it being too useful outside of an extremely high authority and isolationist playthrough. Maybe that's where this run should go next. Autocracy, ethno-state, state religion, and isolationist to stack up authority. We'll see. Let me know what you want to see. Stay tuned for the next episode of the American Social Democracy, and the next episode of the German Council Republic. Thank you for your time.